Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. Today's topic: Discover Yellowstone's Ultimate Wolf and Wildlife Safari. Presented by NatHab Expedition Leader Jake Richards. I'm your host, Rob Mess. Thank you for being here with us today. Take it away, Jake.
All right, thanks, Rob, and thanks everybody for tuning in. Uh, Getting excited for our winter Yellowstone season. So my presentation today is going to be on that ultimate wolf and wildlife safari. So this is what we call the Know Before You Go series. So I'll be going over a lot of kind of the nuts and bolts and logistics of this itinerary. If you're interested in some of the more natural history topics, learning about wolves, learning about the weather, learning about wildlife, I'll touch on a few of those topics, but we have a whole library of really amazing webinars that talk about that. Or obviously, the best way to learn about those things is to come on a trip with us. So let's get started. So, a little bit about me. I'm originally from Vermont. In fact, I'm tuning in right now from New Hampshire. I came back to the Northeast to spend some time with family for Thanksgiving. Here in Vermont, I got a couple of degrees in history and environmental science. And when you get a bachelor's degree in history in 2009, you probably would do what I did, and I became a forklift driver for about a decade. So when I decided I didn't want to do that forever, I went back to school, got that environmental science degree, and that kind of set me on the path towards wildlife guiding. I got to move out to the Tetons, did a graduate program through Teton Science Schools, and then a master's program at Utah State University, which is in Logan, Utah. That's where I call home now. I live in northern Utah, just a couple hours down the road from Jackson Hole, Wyoming. And yeah, I've been with Natural Habitat Adventures for 4 years now, and I've guided locations throughout the U.S. National Park System, as you can see from these photos here, down in Florida, up in Glacier, our Canyon Strip, Yosemite Trip. But I spend a lot of time in Yellowstone, the lead guide for the Yellowstone winter and summer programs, as well as Glacier. And really love Yellowstone. That was kind of my introduction to the West, was spending time in that area. And I'm excited to get back up there. And let's see, it'll be about a month. I'll be up in Jackson Hole again. So quick overview of what I'll be going through in this presentation. I'm going to talk about why you and everyone should visit Yellowstone in the wintertime. I'll do a brief overview of the landscape, get a little bit into some of those natural history topics, but it'll be a pretty high level view of some of the things that we'll be looking at. Then I'll get into those nuts and bolts that I was talking about, the logistics, lodging, transportation, and then I will do a brief run through of the trip itinerary. Again, keeping it pretty high level, but really what we want to do in this webinar is kind of give you some information so you know what to expect if you've booked this trip or if you're thinking about booking one of these trips. Then before closing, I'm going to talk about what gear you should bring and a little bit about the gear that we provide, because I know that Yellowstone in the wintertime is a pretty cold place, and I'm sure a lot of you have questions about what you should pack and what things we provide, so I'll be going over that. Before closing with a few photos and a little bit about the wildlife that we hope and expect to see on this trip. So, why is this place so special? Well, winter in Yellowstone, the short answer is just because of the serenity, because it's a magical place. There are very few people that visit Yellowstone in the wintertime. If you've been to Yellowstone in the summertime, you kind of know it's a popular spot. We have some tips and tricks and ways that we avoid the crowds on our summer trips, but a lot of the areas that you visit in Yellowstone are busy in the summer. Coming here in the wintertime, it's a tiny fraction of the visitation of the entire calendar year. And so a lot of places like this photo here, we might even have to ourselves, which is almost unheard of in the summertime. But another reason why this place is so special in the wintertime is because it is a place of extremes. And, we talk at length about some of those extremes, things like the Yellowstone supervolcano and some of the wildlife, that can be found, very few places on the continent. But really, the weather, the cold, the topography, it's all very extreme. And because of that, the people that have lived in this place for thousands of years, as well as the wildlife that has adapted to live in Yellowstone and the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, um, the they're built different, as some people might say. And so seeing them in that extreme climate, in those extreme conditions, is you really start to understand why the wildlife and why some of these organisms, have evolved the way that they have. So where is Yellowstone National Park? Let's just kind of get our bearings, a little geography here. You can see on that big left-hand map where it's located in the United States. It's right on the border of Wyoming, Idaho, and Montana, primarily located in the state of Wyoming. That top right map, a little hard to see, but you can kind of see the area that we cover on this trip from Jackson, starting in the south, moving up through Yellowstone. We end our trip in Bozeman. We do have two different, I don't want to say versions of this trip. You could book this trip and we would be moving from Jackson up to Bozeman. You could also book this trip and we'd be moving from Bozeman south down to Jackson. But they are the same trip. We do the same activities. It's the same itinerary. You just be moving from north to south or vice versa. And then one other thing I just want to mention, that bottom right map, you can see Yellowstone National Park. It's kind of that gray square shape in the middle. Grand Teton is that other gray shape down below. But that larger red shaded area is what we call the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem. Sometimes, we'll use the shorthand GYE, but that's what we're referring to, Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem. And that's a term that we use throughout the trip, and I'll probably use that term in this presentation as well. And that's because, as you might imagine, wildlife does not adhere to park boundaries, or state boundaries, or public land versus private land. And so that collective term Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem refers to all of the natural communities and all the wildlife that inhabit those communities that are kind of in that greater ecosystem. So the way to think about it is the ecosystem is kind of like the larger metropolitan area. And within that ecosystem, you have these different habitats, different natural communities that are kind of like the neighborhoods. And a lot of organisms kind of move between those different communities. But holistically, we often refer to the greater Yellowstone ecosystem as this larger natural area that we move through throughout this trip. So, there's a book called Life in the Cold, Peter Marchand. I don't have it with me. It's one that I do recommend if you're interested in learning more about wildlife and how wildlife has evolved to, how has wildlife adapted to cold climates. And it's a really fascinating book, a lot of pretty heady science, but it really gives a great explanation about some of these organisms that we see. Basically, you have three different ways that you can adapt as an organism to extreme climates like winter in Yellowstone. You either hibernate, you migrate, or you tolerate. Now, when we're looking for wildlife in the wintertime, we're probably not going to see those animals that hibernate. A famous one in Yellowstone is going to be the bears. When you see me do my summer Yellowstone webinar, I talk a lot about bears. They're one of my favorite animals. They're something that we look for, especially on our summer trips. We're not going to see them on the winter trip. Technically, we could see one because they don't go into true hibernation. They go into a state of torpor, so occasionally they wake up, but I've never seen one in the winter. It's not an animal that we look for because they're considered a hibernating animal. Now, that second adaptation is migrate. We won't see most of the animals that migrate out of the area, because they're snowbirds just like a lot of humans, and they'll go south to warmer climates, or they'll go out to the coast. They'll go to other areas in the wintertime because, again, the conditions are so extreme here in Yellowstone. Some of the animals that migrate, we do still see, like you can see that photo on the right of the bighorn. A few animals like bighorn and pronghorn, elk as well. They do migrate, but they do seasonal migrations between winter foraging areas and summer foraging areas. And so we still have the opportunity to see animals like bighorn, pronghorn, elk. They're just going to be in different places than we would look for them in the summertime. But primarily what we're going to be looking at is those animals that have adapted to tolerate those extreme conditions. And the best example is that animal on the left, and that is the bison, the American bison. I'll talk a little bit more about that animal later on in the presentation because they are one of the reasons that I really think everyone should go to Yellowstone in the wintertime, and I'll explain that more in depth when we get to that point. But again, it's an extreme place, a lot of snow, a lot of very cold and windy temperatures, which makes for a really exciting adventure to go to Yellowstone in the wintertime. Another reason why Yellowstone in the wintertime is such a cool place is because of the geothermals. We'll talk at length about the Yellowstone supervolcano, about the hot spot under the Earth's crust, and how that creates and impacts all of these really interesting geothermal features that are throughout Yellowstone. In fact, this is the reason why Yellowstone became America's first national park back in 1872. Just because of the concentration of all these geothermal features. And they are incredible to see any time of year. But the interesting thing is they look different every time of year. And a lot of that has to do with, again, the cold. You're going to kind of hear a theme, of the cold conditions up here in Yellowstone. But geothermals, because of that extreme temperature differential between, boiling or near boiling water, and air temperatures that might be as low as -30, -40 degrees, you just have just this explosion of steam. You have this collection of rime on the trees that create these ghost trees, and sometimes even the bison themselves will have frost-covered backs and noses, and so the landscape itself looks very different in the wintertime than it does in the summertime, and these geothermals are a really cool example of that. So seeing Old Faithful, which is in this photo right here, seeing that in the wintertime is a much different experience than it is in the summertime. So the activities on this trip, this is considered a low activity trip. A lot of that does have to do with some of those extreme conditions that we were talking about. It's not necessarily uh, the most comfortable. I don't want to say it's unsafe for us to go on a long hike because all the guides, are wilderness first responders and we would keep you all safe. But it's just not necessarily the most fun, the primary way that we explore this landscape in the wintertime. We do have some opportunities to do some snowshoeing, like you can see in this photo here. If you are interested in doing that, it's a good thing to communicate that to your guide because one of the great things about working for NatHab is that the guides are given a lot of autonomy to kind of tailor the trips based on the things that you want to do as a guest. So if you're interested in snowshoeing or doing a little hiking here and there, we can make that happen, and we do have those opportunities on this trip. On the other end of the spectrum, a lot of times we get the question about, are we outside all day, every day? And the answer is no, we do have opportunities throughout the trip to do some indoor activities to warm us up. One of which is going to the Wildlife Art Museum down in Jackson, which you can see in this photo here. We also get the opportunity to visit with a local photographer and videographer that has been in the Yellowstone area for a very long time, has a lot of great stories. So throughout the trip, we do have indoor activities as well as spending time outdoors. But again, just want to set that expectation. This is considered a low activity trip. Our main priority is to find wildlife. That's true for all NatHab trips, including this one. And a lot of times in Yellowstone, because it's a very big park, one of the ways that we do that is in vehicles. So accommodations, the way the trip works, I'm going to go through the itinerary in a few slides, but we do kind of have a mix of accommodations from um, staying down in Jackson for a couple of nights. It's kind of based in, we stay in Jackson for a couple of nights, then we'll move into the park. We'll get to stay at the beautiful Snow Lodge right at Old Faithful. So we will be spending a night right in the heart of the park, right at Old Faithful. And the only way to access that area is either through a snow coach or a snowmobile. Those are called over the snow vehicles. And we use snow coaches to get into the park so we can stay at the Snow Lodge overnight, which is a beautiful experience. Not a lot of people are in Yellowstone that time of year, and even fewer of them are staying overnight inside the park. So that's a really special part of this trip, is being able to stay at the Snow Lodge in the middle of the trip. Okay, so we're very excited. Last winter season, almost a year ago now, I guess it was last February or March, we got these new updated 2023 vehicles that were customized specifically for these trips and for the types of trips that NatHab does. We will be using these vehicles for this winter season, and they're really incredible vehicles. We're really excited to have these in the fleet because they, like I said, they're perfectly designed for what we do. You know, they have the hatches that you can see in this photo here, which make for a really great way to view wildlife for a number of different reasons. One of which is, getting that perspective, getting up higher. In the summertime, it's useful because, we can kind of get into areas that other vehicles can't. But a really important feature of these vehicles is that when we get out of the vehicle, a lot of times that impacts the behavior of the animal. These animals, they usually see and hear quite a few cars going by. And so we've found, that vehicles impact animal behavior less than if they were to see another animal, that being us humans walking around. And so, especially in the wintertime, um, you'll hear me at our orientation dinner talking at great length about how to view wildlife respectfully. And one of the ways that we do that is by using the vehicles. And so it's great to have these new vehicles, perfectly designed, very safe for winter travel, and they're just perfect for viewing wildlife. We do rule number two: everybody gets a window seat. Is kind of a promise that NatHab has made ever since I've been guiding for them. So we usually, most of our trips, you'll have two guides. We'll be traveling in two vans, and our groups will be capped at about 14 people, which means these are large vehicles. They're basically built for 12 passengers, but we make sure that we only have half that number in each vehicle, so everybody gets a window seat. That also means that there's a lot of space um, for those extra layers, for your mittens, for your camera, for your bag, et cetera, et cetera. And we'll get more into gear later on in the presentation, but that's one of the other benefits of these vehicles, and how we only put a handful of people in each one, is so we have plenty of room for all the gear that we need for these trips. And that brings us to rule number one. You'll never go hungry on an at-hab trip. So we kind of run the whole spectrum of meal types on this trip. We eat at a number of really wonderful restaurants, both in Jackson and up in Bozeman and in between. We also do some field meals, which, as a guide, I am very grateful that NatHab, allows us to do field meals. We have a great support team that will be providing a lot of that food in the field for us. And that really allows us to maximize our time out in the field, out looking for wildlife. So we're not necessarily having to drive back and forth, to base our schedule off of reservations all the time. We can kind of dictate a lot of that schedule based on the wildlife that we're seeing and the wildlife that we're trying to see, because we do some of those field meals throughout the trip. But really great food on this trip. Also, another reason why I love being a guide is, we eat some good food, and this trip's no exception. So let me take a few minutes to walk through a sample itinerary, what a trip looks like. Now, like I said before, When you book this trip, it's a 7-day trip, and you're either going to be going from Jackson in the south, south end of Jackson Hole, moving north and ending the trip in Bozeman. Alternatively, you could be um, booking a trip that runs from Bozeman and goes down to Jackson. I'm going to be doing just a single departure, a Jackson departure, but keep in mind it's the same trip. We do the same activities. The order of the days are just going to be reversed. So day one is arrival day. You can actually see in this photo, if you look way in the distance, some of those lights up there driving on the road are going past the airport. So the airport is actually in Grand Teton National Park, which is kind of an interesting piece of its history. But you'll fly into Jackson. If you arrive on day one, you'll get picked up by NatHab staff, probably one of your guides. If you do come in a day or two early, which I know a lot of travelers do these days, just because sometimes travel can be a little unpredictable and flight delays and everything, you will have to just arrange your own transportation to town. It's only about 20 minutes. And I know a question I've had in the past is, should I arrive a day or two early? Are there things to do? And I say yes, 100%. Both Jackson and Bozeman are really interesting towns. They have very walkable downtown areas. And so, yeah, if that's something that you're interested in, they are both good places to spend a day or two if you do happen to arrive early. If you arrive on day one, we'll pick you up. And then the evening of day one, we will have a welcome dinner and orientation where we'll do a presentation not dissimilar to this. We'll kind of orient you to what the trip entails and set some ground rules. We'll have a few more details as far as things like weather, things like what wildlife has been seen recently, and what activities that particular departure will be doing. All right, day two. Again, this is for a Jackson departure. We'll get up in the morning and we're going to go explore Jackson Hole. So Jackson Hole is the name of the entire valley. Jackson is the town that sits at the south end of that valley. And the Jackson Hole Valley is basically bordered by mountain ranges on the west and on the east, which means it's a kind of a corridor for wildlife, especially in the wintertime. And we're going to go out looking for animals. We'll spend the morning basically just doing that. It's basically a morning wildlife safari. Before midday, we'll go to lunch at the National Museum of Wildlife Art. They have a great restaurant right in the museum, and we'll spend some time in that museum because they have some beautiful artwork. It's an incredible museum. We get a docent tour, and it's a really fun experience. Then after that, we're going to go for a sleigh ride on the National Elk Refuge. And the history of the National Elk Refuge is just fascinating. We get some awesome guides that run those sleigh rides. I won't try to steal their thunder by doing a lot of interpretation on the history of the elk refuge just because they are incredibly knowledgeable. But it's really interesting that, like I said, elk are one of those animals that have these seasonal migrations between different mountainous areas in the region. And the elk refuge is one of those winter feeding areas. So you have all of these herds of elk, multiple herds of elk, that congregate in the south end of the Jackson Hole Valley. And so we can see as many as 3,000, 4,000, sometimes 5,000 elk in this single part of the valley. And they get used to the horses, they get used to these sleighs that go through. So we have some really incredible viewing opportunities of elk while we're learning about them out there in the field. Probably we'll see some other wildlife out there as well. The elk are not usually alone in these feeding areas. Sometimes you have some rodents. The rodents bring in animals like coyotes and eagles. So anyway, just a really fun experience, and we'll really hit the wildlife hard that first day. We'll see some really incredible things here in Jackson Hole. Day three, we're going to head north. We're going to take our vans and drive up to the south entrance of Yellowstone, where we'll climb aboard our snow coaches. And snow coaches are featured right here in this photo. They're basically monster trucks that are built to travel over the snow, similar to a snowmobile. They can handle the snowy conditions of Yellowstone. And again, great opportunity. It's one of the things that makes Yellowstone in the wintertime kind of unique because they limit how you can travel through the park. There's very few roads that remain open year round. So the only way to get around the park is in a snowmobile or one of these snow coaches. And so we're going to take snow coaches up into the park. We plan on stopping at West Thumb Geyser Basin. That's going to be kind of our first introduction to the geothermal features that we'll see throughout the trip. And it's right on the shore of Yellowstone Lake, and that's also where we eat lunch. So that's a really cool experience and a great introduction to kind of the heart of Yellowstone, which includes a lot of those geothermals. We'll continue north. We'll make some stops along the way. We'll be looking for wildlife. We'll have some scenic stops, and we're going to end the day at the Old Faithful Snow Lodge, right in what's called the Upper Geyser Basin that contains Old Faithful. Now, I like to point out that the evening of day 3 and the morning of day 4 is really a highlight of this trip because we get to stay right at Old Faithful. And so we get some really incredible opportunities just to enjoy the tranquility of this area in the wintertime. Again, I try to point out what makes this trip unique, why Yellowstone in the wintertime is different from Yellowstone in the summertime. And this is a huge part of that because seeing Old Faithful with just a handful of other people around is pretty incredible. You know, being able to hear the roar of the water coming out of the Earth's crust because there aren't a lot of people, you know, oohing and awing, which is also kind of a fun, interesting experience, but very different. And so we'll have some opportunities to do some group walks around the geothermal areas, but we're close enough to the trails and all the boardwalks and these incredible features that you can just go out and wander on your own and just take in just that serenity, which is a really cool part of this trip. The following day, we're going to get back in a snow coach and we're going to do some more exploration of the interior of Yellowstone. The destinations that day are going to be dictated by weather, by wildlife, and a few other factors. But we will be ending the day near the Gardner Mammoth Hot Springs area up at the north entrance of the park. This is Mammoth Hot Springs here in the photo. And so, again, this day is kind of one of our flexible days that based on the things that you want to see and based on, what weather and other conditions allow, we're going to do some exploring of the northern part of Yellowstone, ending our day in Gardner. The next day, this is our big day. They're all big days. If you've been on an at-hab trip, we pack our days pretty tight. We have a lot of really awesome, exciting activities. But I know a lot of people book this trip because they want to go look for wolves in Yellowstone in the wintertime. And I can guarantee you that your guides, this is their number one priority on these trips, is trying to find wolves. Because if you are a guide in Yellowstone, I can promise you that your guide is going to be passionate about the story of the wolves in Yellowstone, and you are going to learn so much about that story because it's just an incredible history of a wild animal in North America. And day 5 is kind of our big day to head into the Lamar Valley, which is some of the best wolf watching in North America, definitely the best in the lower 48. And that's where we're going to spend the day. We're going to probably get up early. Your guide will tell you specifically what time that is, depending on, what time sunrise is and a few other factors. But our goal that day is to head to the Lamar, find some wildlife, hopefully find some canines. And that afternoon, we are going to we'll have a little bit of a break where we're going to go chat with Dan Hartman, who is a really incredible wildlife photographer. And we do that right in his home. He's got a wood stove. It's nice and toasty. Feels pretty good after, a morning spent out in the field looking for animals. So we'll be leaving from the northwest corner of Yellowstone. Dan Hartman's is the northeast corner of Yellowstone. So the entire day we're going to be traveling through what's called the Northern Range, kind of the northern mountains of Yellowstone National Park. And so we're going to be in prime wildlife habitat the entire day. When we leave Dan Hartman's, again, we're going to be coming through the Lamar Valley again, looking for, primarily wolves, but again, there's a lot of other um, critters out there in the wintertime that we're going to be looking for before ending the day back in the Gardner Mammoth Hot Springs area. And that will be, again, big day, day 5. Day 6, we're going to have a morning opportunity to go look for more wildlife. Again, this is going to be dictated a lot by what we've seen so far and the intel or the information that your guide has gotten about where different animals are. NatHab guides are extremely experienced, and we all have a very strong network of other guides in the Yellowstone area. Most of us have lived up there for a substantial amount of time, and so we have great ways of finding information about what animals are being seen in what areas. And so this final morning, again, we give ourselves a little bit of flex time. So if there's a particular animal or a particular area that we want to target, we have the freedom to do that the morning of day 6. About midday, early afternoon or so, we're going to start making our way north because we're going to be ending our day in Bozeman. And we're going to be driving, when we leave Yellowstone National Park, we'll be driving through an area called Paradise Valley. Still some really incredible wildlife opportunities on that drive. So we'll be stopping for some animals depending on what we see and how much time that we have before ending our day in Bozeman, where we're going to have our farewell dinner. That farewell dinner is going to be at a hotel called the Armory. They take really good care of us. They do a private room with a private dinner, wonderful food, great staff, and we'll have our farewell dinner, share some stories, and that will be where we conclude our trip because day 7 is departure day. We'll be making sure we take care of everybody's travel arrangements on this final day to get you off to your next adventure. And it goes by quick. 7 days, it's a full week, but each day is pretty action packed and it goes by pretty quick. Okay, shifting gears a little bit here. Let's talk about gear. And I know this is probably why most of you tuned in today, is to hear the information that I'm going to talk about on this slide here. So it gets cold up there. The last 2 seasons, I've hit negative 40 during the day on our trips. Also, both seasons, I have not had people get cold. And that's one thing that I'm very proud of. It's one thing that NatHab takes very good care to make sure people are comfortable. And we do that by providing a lot of gear for you. That includes warm parkas. That includes warm winter boots. One second. That includes optics, and by optics I mean we have spotting scopes, we have binoculars, the tools that we need to see animals that might be a little ways away, and that does happen in Yellowstone, and that's going to be something we talk about at orientation as well. One of the great things, one of the reasons we go to places like the Lamar Valley to look for animals like wolves, part of it has to do with these big open river valleys are places where elk congregate and other prey species congregate in the wintertime. And that draws in the wolves. And that's why looking for wolves in the wintertime sometimes, not always, but sometimes can be more successful than in the summertime. That also means that these big open river valleys, we might see a wolf and it might be a mile away. And because of that, we make sure that we have the tools to see those animals clearly, to be able to watch that behavior. And that includes those spotting scopes and those binoculars that we provide. We also provide trekking poles and traction devices you can put on your boots. I call them creepers. They're not quite crampons, but they're little teeth that strap onto the bottom of your boots. Because some of the places like Old Faithful and West Thumb, where those geothermals are, can get a little icy. A lot of it has to do with the steam that's being produced by those geothermal features. But we do take care of that. We at least in my knowledge, we haven't had injuries or anything serious, and that's because we have the proper gear to do this adventure. And then finally, hand warmers. We do keep buckets and buckets of hand warmers in the vehicles, toe warmers. So keep your hands warm, keep your toes warm, because nothing can make wildlife viewing not fun. Um, as bad as when your hands get too cold that it's hard to hold the binoculars and etc. So again, we know what we're doing and we take good care of people, and we always have positive feedback about how people were able to be comfortable even in some of these extreme temperatures. So, what gear should you bring? Obviously, layers. So, a simple layering system is what we call the base mid shell system. That means wear a base layer. So, that would be, long johns, thermals, leggings, whatever you want to call it. And that is both for upper body, so like a long sleeve, thermal shirt, and also lower body, something, a thin layer, like long underwear against your skin. The mid layer usually is something like a synthetic hiking pant, sometimes something as simple as a synthetic sweatpant. That's what I wear. And something on top like a fleece. Synthetic is always a good way to go. Synthetic and wool. You can see a couple of list items down. I have that expression "cotton kills" in quotes, and that's something that outdoor enthusiasts know that expression, because cotton is not great, especially as a base layer, because it doesn't keep you warm once it gets wet. And so wool layers and synthetic layers are always a good way to go. And then finally a shell layer. So base, mid, and then finally shell. So the upper shell would be that warm parka that we provide. It's a good idea to bring like ski pants or some type of waterproof pant. Rain pants are probably okay as long as you're layered up with a thick mid layer. But usually that base mid shell system, you're going to be pretty much bulletproof for the conditions that we're going to be seeing. Um, that other item that I have there, warm hat and gloves or mittens. We do have Nat Hab fleece hats, which are very warm. If you have a warm hat that you can try on and make sure it's comfortable before you get out here, that's always a plus. And then gloves or mittens. That's probably the most important piece of gear, is going to be a good pair of gloves or mittens. I always tell people mittens are a good way to go. They keep your hands much warmer, and you can put hand warmers in them very comfortably. So if you're not sure what to get, gloves or mittens, if you're worried about being chilly, mittens are always going to be warmer. Finally, that last one asked me about my gear. I love talking about this. I've lived in Vermont, Wyoming, Utah, a lot of cold climates. I've tried a lot of different gear. I can answer a lot of questions about it. Happy to answer emails or any questions about gear you might have. Last few items down here. Bring a day pack, kind of like the one that my friend Lou is wearing in the photo. Just like a small backpack is fine. Something that you can put those layers in if you need to shed. You might keep your binoculars, your camera, water bottle in that pack. Water bottle, another good thing to bring. Even though it's going to be cold, a lot of people don't um, they don't think to drink a lot of water because you're not sweating a lot, you're not getting really hot, we're not doing a ton of hiking, but we are going to be up at elevation throughout the trip. In fact, most of Yellowstone is between 6 and 8,000 feet in elevation. So that one of the best ways that we combat the effects of that elevation is drinking lots of water. So make sure you got that water bottle. Feel free to bring the camera. A lot of the guides are photographers, myself included, and so we love talking about photography or helping you get some of those shots. We do run some photo departures in winter in Yellowstone, so talk to your adventure specialist if you are interested in spending more time getting the shot or learning about photography, because we do have photo departures. And then the last thing is sun protection. And that, again, sounds kind of crazy to talk about for a winter trip. But being at elevation on a sunny day, not only are you getting sun, through thinner air that can often burn people pretty easily, getting sunburned, but you also get that reflective factor off the snow. And so a lot of times people's faces, can burn a little bit. We carry sunscreen, but the main thing is I would pack some sunglasses because your eyes are going to get pretty tired. And with that, when the landscape is white and the sun comes out, having sun protection is pretty important. Okay, a lot of information. We're coming down to the wire here. I'm going to do a few more slides talking about the cold and why we recommend all this gear, why we provide a lot of the gear. Here are some of the temperatures that we're looking at. So throughout the trip, like I talked about, we're going to be in places like Jackson, we'll be at Old Faithful, Gardner, and Cook City. And in January, you can see that the average high for most of these places is in the 20s, and the average low is in the single digits. So that, again, is average. Those are kind of the average temperatures that we're talking about. You got to factor wind chill factor, and these are averages, which means there's going to be days that are quite a bit colder than that. You can see that photo on the right is on a NatHab trip. Looking at, we were at Slough Creek, and if you look real close, I think that thermometer reading is about -36, -37 in the sun right there. So it can get chilly, and these are some of the average temperatures that we'll be looking at. Photography, I'm not going to spend too much time talking about photography, just basically two main things. One is, again, we have photo departures. If you're interested, let's chat about that. And two, in my camera bag, I bring two lenses, a 18 to 135 and also a 70 to 350. If you don't know what that means, don't worry about it. But all that means is we do have opportunities for beautiful landscape photography, and we're going to have opportunities for wildlife photography. So if you are bringing a camera, just keep in mind that you know having two lenses can be really helpful because it's not solely wildlife photography and it's not solely landscape photography. We're going to get a really awesome mix. So anyway, if you are a photographer, that information might be useful. Okay, last few slides here are some of the wildlife that we hope to see, some of the ones that we expect to see. Sometimes I say the animals that we target on this trip, the ones that I consider a successful Yellowstone wildlife trip, is when we see these animals. So this first one, this is a pronghorn. Sometimes they're referred to as antelope. Really interesting, evolutionary history, kind of a true North American native. And they're one of those animals that migrates seasonally, but they migrate within the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. So we often have opportunities. We don't get them every trip, but sometimes we do see some pronghorn in the wintertime, which again makes for a really beautiful subject, especially for photography. The moose, Alcis alcis. We'll talk at length about the moose. Again, this is one of the primary species that we look for, especially down in Jackson Hole, where there's more wetlands and a few other things that draw the moose to that area. Another animal that really has incredibly unique adaptations for very cold temperatures and lots of snow. And yeah, I'll leave it at that because, again, as a guide, I'm trying to hold back as far as giving you the full fire hose of information about some of these animals. So, bighorn sheep, really incredible animal, fascinating animal. This is down in Jackson Hole. We have a couple different places that we look for these animals. Just really beautiful animal, when they, especially in the habitat that they occupy this time of year. So they don't like to have to work too hard to get down to the grasses that they feed on throughout the winter, but they still live in parts of the country that get a lot of snow. So you try to figure out, well, how do you find areas where there is not a lot of snow? And so they have figured out, well, if you go to the very top a very windy cliff face, not as much snow collects. A lot of the wind, will blow the snow away. And so it makes for extreme habitats, like you can see in this photo. But they can get to the food that they need to sustain themselves throughout the winter time. So really incredible to see them in that habitat in winter. All right, the elk. Like I said, we do a sleigh ride on the National Elk Refuge, and I can almost guarantee you, um, you will not learn more about elk while looking at elk, and it's just such a cool experience to go through the elk refuge on a sleigh ride. So I'll leave it at that. Incredible animal with a really interesting conservation history in this area. Okay, the bison, the buffalo. I saved this one for last. Well, not quite last, next to last, because I have a big speech about bison in the wintertime, and it's you hear a lot of stories about people in Yellowstone that get in trouble going right up to the bison. They sometimes get injured. They get hurt by the bison, and it's because bison in the summertime look very docile. A lot of people think they're cows. International visitors often think that they're a domesticated animal, and that's because that's exactly what they look like in the summertime. But when you go in the wintertime, you start to see why they look the way that they look. They have all these shaggy coats, and the fur on the front of their legs is much thicker than the ones on the back, and they got these big giant heads. Um, and the reason for all of those things I just listed is because this animal is adapted for this climate, for this place. They can plow through, feet and feet of snow. They can tolerate extremely cold temperatures, and their head, I think, is just the most incredible feature of this animal. Their massive head is mounted basically directly onto these giant, powerful shoulders because they use that head as a big old bulldozer. This is snow plow, and they use it to push feet and feet of snow out of the way so they can get down to the grasses below. And these are things that you see in the summertime. Obviously, you see this animal and what it looks like, but you don't get to see it in action until you see it in Yellowstone in the wintertime. So, again, just incredible to see this animal in its natural habitat in the wintertime. And then finally, wolves. We talk a lot about wolves on this trip. Again, we have wolf in the name of the trip because that is, the primary animal that we're looking for. You know, uh, Obviously they can be very elusive. We don't always see them. Yellowstone is 2.2 million acres. There's usually between 100 and 150 wolves in the park at any given time, and so that means they can be difficult to find. But when we do find them, it's a wildlife experience, unlike any other in North America. And a lot of that has to do with the incredible history of the animal in this place. And I'm sure a lot of you know a lot about that history. You might even know more than me about that history, just because it's been a part of the American psyche for the last 30 years now, coming up on 30 years, when they were reintroduced to Yellowstone back in 95. And so I think I'm going to leave it at that. To see wolves in Yellowstone in the wintertime is truly an incredible experience for any wildlife enthusiast. And it's something that we always try to deliver. And I can promise that your guide is going to be extremely passionate about this animal and about finding this animal on these trips. And with that, I went a little long, but let's open it up to any questions.
All right, Jake, thank you so much. Now, before we start in with the question and answer session, I would like to remind everyone that you can submit your questions via the question field in your control panel. All right, let's get to these questions. So I know there's a lot of weather and snow, but will we be able to use tripods?
We tripods?
Yes.
Yes. Yep. There are opportunities for that. If you're a photographer, I would say bring it along if you have room for it. Yes is the short answer. And again, because we only put 6 or 7 people in each vehicle, we usually do have space to bring that along.
Good to know. Thank you so much. So, is it possible to see bobcat or lynx on these trips?
So lynx are incredibly rare. They are in Yellowstone. There was one spotted in Yellowstone around the West Thumb area last year. I didn't see it. We heard from a ranger. Um, Bobcat, I would say we see bobcat maybe once a season or so. They are around. A lot of times what we will look for is carcasses because calories are hard to come by in Yellowstone in the wintertime. So anytime there's a winter kill or a carcass, that's going to be something that we focus on and we watch for a little while. And occasionally, a bobcat might be one of the animals coming to that carcass. They're pretty elusive. Most of the felines are. That's kind of a feature of the cat family, is they're more nocturnal and more elusive. So I would say lynx, very, very unlikely. Bobcat, possible.
Great. Thanks for tackling that.
Hmm.
So, I know on the regular trips, they're not photocentric, but will I have enough time to get some photographs, even if I'm not coming on the photograph trip?
Sure. Yeah, I would say, all of the photos in this presentation were ones that I took while on our NatHab trips, and these were not photo departures. These were regular trips. And that was while I was guiding, which means, as a guest, you will have more time than I do to get good photos. I would just say, just make sure, I want to set the expectation that our goal is going to be to find wildlife and view wildlife. So getting the shot is not necessarily going to be a priority, but we're going to see some pretty interesting things. And if you have a camera, you're going to get some great shots regardless. It's just not going to be one of our priorities.
Gotcha. Thank you so much.
Hmm.
So, if there's a major storm or road closures, are we still going to be able to move around and see different wildlife?
Yes. Yeah, 100%. And that does happen. We've had departures where we've had um, to change plans kind of last minute based on weather. But I can guarantee you that your guide has plan A, plan B, plan C, and all of those plans do include looking for wildlife, going on routes and going to areas where we're going to see wildlife. Um, Fortunately, we have good vehicles and we have an itinerary that has weathered the storm, both literally and figuratively, over the years. And so those disruptions are pretty minimal. So, yeah, it's going to be a great trip, even if we get some big snowstorms.
Great, thank you. So, are we ever going off road on using snowmobiles or leaving the roads or the pullouts if we're going to do some viewing of, say, wolves in the Lamar Valley?
So we'll have some opportunity. So we do not do snowmobiles. We do snow coaches that travel the same areas that snowmobiles go. So you can't take a snowmobile off road. So let me clarify. So all of the over the snow travel corridors, what you might call the roads or the trails, those are the same routes as the roads in the summertime because they're groomed, because the wildlife are used to vehicles traveling through those areas. So, regardless of whether you're on a snowmobile or a snow coach, you're still traveling the same areas. So, I say that just to make sure it's not like the snowmobiles are going places that we can't go. Lamar Valley is difficult to get off the road. There's not a lot of hiking opportunities. Most of our hiking and walking is going to be around the geothermal areas, places like West Thumb, places like Old Faithful, the Upper Geyser Basin, and there's a handful more. We don't do a ton of hiking in the Lamar Valley area. Primarily, we're going to be viewing from vehicles in the Lamar. Not from the vehicles, we'll be getting out and using scopes and everything, but from the roadways in Lamar.
Can you talk about what the differences are between the photo departures and the regular itineraries?
I can't speak to a lot of those details because I don't run the photo departures. So I would talk to your adventure specialist to get some of those differences. A lot of it is going to be earlier mornings, later evenings, because you're staying out like all the way until dark. Um, some of those trips I know are longer or have slightly different itineraries, but I don't want to speak to what I don't know about. So I would say talk to your adventure specialist for those details.
Great. Thank you so much.
Hmm.
Is it okay to bring our own spotting scope?
You can. It might take up a little more room than necessary, but I've had guests do that in the past, and that wasn't really an issue. I would say it's totally fine. It's just a little unnecessary.
Gotcha. Thank you. So can the scopes that we do have be fitted to use with our mobile phones?
So your guides will have the ability to do that because um, you have to get what's called a digiscope, which is an attachment that fits the scope and also fits your phone. If you bring an attachment for your particular phone, we could try to use that. Usually, what we do, we have a really incredible photo sharing platform for those of you that are familiar with it in the Adventure portal. So, usually, what we do is your guides will be taking lots of photos and videos and things, both with their camera and with their phones. And then all of those will be shared with the entire group. So those things that we captured that we viewed collectively, whether it's through the scope or just in person, we'll be sharing all of those with all of you. So feel free to bring that attachment if you want to get one. Just keep in mind, not all of those fit every scope, but we do have the ability as guides to capture those things with our phones.
Great. Thank you. So if we're out and about all day long, are there going to be opportunities for me to use the bathroom?
Absolutely. Yeah. Once we get up into the park, a lot of those bathrooms are going to be cold. A lot of them, especially in the Lamar Valley, are going to be like outhouses. We call them pit toilets. So they're going to be a little chilly. They're not going to have plumbing. But again, we almost every day we'll have indoor activities. Places like the museum. We'll be stopping in Cook City. So, yes, plenty of bathroom stops. A handful of them will be kind of chilly, especially when we're in the Lamar Valley area.
Gotcha. Thank you. So what about our luggage? Is it going to be transported with us at all times? Or is it going to be staying in one separate place that we go back to?
Great question. So you will have your day pack, which you will have access to at all times. Your luggage will be moving separately. So you will not have access to your luggage throughout the course of the day. We have an awesome support team that gets luggage from Hotel A to Hotel B. So we don't have to worry about it. We don't have to use our own vehicles for that space. So we can carry things like scopes and thermoses of coffee and necessities like that. So you will not have access to your luggage throughout the day. It'll just be waiting at the hotel when you get there in the evening.
Great. Thanks, Jake. I appreciate you tackling all these questions. Unfortunately, that's the last question that we will have time for today. So I'd like to hand it back to you for some closing comments.
Thanks, Rob. I don't have any grand speech to close it up, but I hope it's become obvious that I'm pretty passionate about this trip. It's a trip that every guide loves to guide because we all love Yellowstone so much, and experiencing it in the wintertime is unlike any other national park experience I think you'll probably have. So I'll leave it at that.
Jake, thank you so much for taking the time to present for us today. And I'd also like to thank everyone who tuned in today. Now, if you're interested in information on how you can travel with NatHab, give us a call at 800-543-8917, or you can send us an email at info@nathab.com. Our adventure specialists are happy to help you out. Join us tomorrow for our next daily dose of nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude today's webinar. Goodbye, everybody. We'll see you next time.